what happens if you leave a company before they vest? Because some people open up that brokerage account and they're like, oh, geez, it may have been a rough day, but I can't leave now. Look at that beautiful number in there.
You're listening to IBKR's Census Security. Find more conversations at ibkrpodcast.com. Please remember, any trading discussions are for information purposes only and are not intended to portray recommendations. Please listen to further disclosures at the end of today's episode. Now, welcome to our show.
Welcome back to Interactive Brokers' Personal Finance Podcast. I'm Cassidy Clement, Senior Manager of SEO and Content at Interactive Brokers. Today, I'm your host for our Stock Vesting podcast, and our guest is Barbara Olander, the Total Rewards Manager here at Interactive Brokers. We're going to cover some stock vesting programs and other details associated with them. Welcome to the program, everyone, and welcome back, Barbara.
Hi, all.
So I know that we're going to say a lot of different things about vesting today as the word, as a verb, but I guess at the basics, I'm aware of stock vesting about earning an asset over time, but the best intro question, I guess, for most people is going to be, what is stock vesting? So, like I said, I know about the earning an asset over time, but for you, what would you explain it in the HR intro speak?
Sure. So, Cass, you are absolutely correct in that vesting means earning an asset over time. Now, that asset is going to be employer-provided incentive. That could be a 401k match. It could be the ability to purchase shares of a stock, of the company stock, through the available plans. But a vesting schedule, as frequently those two terms are coupled, just explains or explicitly identifies the period of time over which an employee earns a particular asset or ability to use a benefit. So very quickly, we talked about previously in another of our podcasts about 401k vesting. That means the vesting there applies to the employer match portion, meaning the employer money that is added to your retirement account, and the length of time over which it takes for the employee to receive it.
So I know that there are several different plans that may apply to when people talk in general about stock vesting, but a popular one, I guess, is the ESOP, the Employee Stock Ownership Plan. And while that's the employee benefits and it kind of encourages the employees to kind of give their all and work to succeed, because then the company's success can kind of translate into a little bit more of their own financial rewards or salary at the end of the year. While there are many different rules with those, I guess I'm not super familiar with it other than in a general conversational type understanding. So what would you explain that? How would you explain that to somebody from the big picture as a plan or a program?
Sure. So employers are trying to come up with different incentives for their employees in order to retain the top talent. An employee stock ownership plan allows the employee to purchase a stock offered by the employer at a particular point in the future on a preset price. So it is one sort of way, like I said earlier, that employers try to incentivize employees to stay with them over a longer period of time. Other versions of employee ownership include direct purchase programs, different setups for stock options, restricted stock, and so on. We're going to touch on a couple of these today.
There seems to be a bunch of different options here. And I know that from what we've kind of talked about a little bit so far and what I'm familiar with, we have RSUs, ISOs, NSOs. With RSUs for restricted stock units, you kind of, at least my understanding, you don't really need to purchase them on your own. You kind of just need to wait for them to vest, and those can be coming to you from sometimes if you just started at a company, or maybe they hit a milestone like an IPO or something like that, and they give out some shares to employers or employees, and then those would vest over time. But those other ones, the ISOs and NSOs, which I believe are the incentive stock options, and then the non-qualified stock options, as far as I know, it's the understanding that, okay, you have the right to buy these. It's not necessarily like the RSU where they're just given to you. But yeah, so could you tell me a little bit more about what those are in comparison to an RSU, and maybe if there is a key difference if you're using those in the stock ownership plans, the ESOPs versus a traditional RSU plan?
Sure. So an ISO or an incentive stock option is usually offered by the employer to key employees only. The employer may decide to offer it to all employees. However, most commonly it is intended for those sort of key employees. RSU is a plan that, again, can have very specific restrictions and who it applies to. But as you said, yes, it allows the employer to grant, so to give employees some number of shares or units of stocks. So let's go back to the employee stock ownership plans. So as we said before, those types of plans only allow you the ability to purchase shares at a set price at some point in the future.
Mm-hmm.
The other side of that, or a different approach to a long-term incentive, would be the restricted stock options, which you mentioned a minute ago. And those are, like I said, granted to the employee. The employee does not have to purchase RSUs. They are given to them and frequently include a vesting schedule, which requires the employee to stay with the company for a set period of time. That could be 3 years, 5 years, some preset duration, in order to become vested in or have full ownership of the shares that they were granted. So key differences between these two types of long-term incentive plans are that ESOPs involve the option to purchase company shares at a predetermined price, whereas RSU are the restricted stock that employees receive as compensation. And then they can sell them after they have vested in those shares. So that, I think, would be the key differences to point out to our list.
So for any of these stock units or stock options, is there anything with like dividend benefits or like voting rights that may differ between the plans, or maybe is it something that happens based on, what you're given?
Sure. Yes. So for ESOPs, they frequently offer voting rights and dividend benefits, while RSUs do not. In some instances, an RSU can include a dividend equivalent payment. So it's not a true dividend. It's a payment that sort of resembles dividends and is an additional benefit to the employee, but is not a true dividend.
So with these different plans then, how do the securities vest? I know that there's different types of schedules with different years or like fractions that you can use to see how many you're looking at per year. But from my research, I saw there were different things called like yearly cliffs. If you can explain that a little bit, because I wasn't super familiar with that.
Sure. So again, just to sort of bring it back to other plans that may include a vesting schedule, there are several types of schedules that are pretty common. For example, earning the benefit or the employer-sponsored grant over a 5-year period, for example, could mean that a person receives 20% for each year of employment that they are with the organization. After a 5-year period, they are entitled to 100% of a particular grant. So that would be sort of a longer term vesting schedule, requiring the employee to stay with the company for a period of at least 5 years in order to take full advantage of the long-term incentive that is being offered. Shorter vesting schedules also exist. Some of them are called cliff vesting schedules, which means that employee receives zero, or there's not a fractional component of the benefit until the employee satisfies that full term requirement. So for example, a 1-year cliff vesting would mean that if an employee leaves their employment within, let's say, 6 or 8 months, they would receive none of the benefit. Whereas if they stay with the employer for at least a year, then 100% of that benefit becomes theirs. Now, sort of a middle ground there would be a 3-year cliff vesting schedule. So again, leaving the employment, within the first 3 years means that the employee receives zero or none of the benefit, whereas if they stay at least 3 years with the employer, then they are entitled to 100% of that long-term incentive, whether that be RSUs or other retirement plan benefits, for example.
Got it. So we talked about them vesting, kind of like becoming yours, but then, the next natural thing for people who are familiar with different financial securities is, okay, great, I have these. What's the catch? How are they taxed? So you would have, as far as I know, you have the option to pay like via cash, or you'd wire it into that brokerage account to cover the taxation on the vesting, or you can do the deduct from shares, so the equivalent of the taxed amount valued at the amount of shares that would equal that. Is there any other ways that I'm missing that come to that explain how they're taxed, or maybe the calculation? I know it has to do with kind of the market value at the time of the vesting. That's what I'm familiar with, but I'm sure with your line of work, you have a lot more exposure.
Yes. So taxes, we all have to pay them. There's no way of escaping them. And with a long-term incentive plan, such as a stock options plan or the RSUs that we discussed, there are two main ways of covering that tax requirement. Either, employees use their own funds to cover the tax expense, or like you said, there is sort of that calculation to figure out how many of the granted shares would need to be used to satisfy the tax requirement, right? So restricted stocks usually become taxable upon the completion of that vesting schedule, right? So depending on how long that takes, that's where the tax event also applies. For restricted stock plans, the entire amount of the vested stock must be counted as ordinary income for the year of vesting. The amount that must be declared is determined by a calculation of subtracting the original purchase price from the exercise price, and then, comparing that to the fair market value of the stock. However, if the shareholder does not sell the stock at vesting and sells it at the later time, then the difference between the sale price and the fair market value on the date of the vesting is reported as either gains or losses.
Right.
So, I think this, for our listeners who as part of their overall compensation have a stock option plan, and they are concerned about or have a particularly intricate taxable situation or tax situation just in their lives, obviously there is no better advice than that of a tax professional, depending again on the sort of individual complexities that may exist. That's the safest way to.
So I know we covered a little bit about at the end there, you'd mentioned about like have them now, and let's say you paid taxes once they vested, but now you want to sell them. So I guess a lot of people have questions about, great, I have this awesome thing now, I'd like to see the cash. Many people will immediately think, when can I sell all of them? Which obviously you got to wait for your vesting schedule. But once they are vested, and they're yours. As far as I know, like they're treated like any other stock. So is there anything else involved with them? Maybe like the blackout period or anything else? I know like ESOPs I'm not as familiar with, but with RSUs, like the blackout dates or maybe different restrictions with when you can sell them as the employee.
So yes, very much in line with what you're saying. That's it's correct. Restricted stock units cannot be sold on or transferred until they become yours. So again, that vesting word plays a part. But once the shares are vested, they are yours, and you are able to sell them. There may be, based on the specific plan rules that apply to an individual's employer plan, that still have to be observed. So for example, blackout dates, meaning a period of time where the plan restricts an employee's ability to sell their vested shares to a specific period of time, could be a consideration that the employee needs to make. All of those details, the restrictions of when and how and under what circumstances shares can be sold, will be described in the plan documents. So definitely, if long-term incentives are a part of your compensation package, reviewing those details, familiarizing yourself with those specific rules is very important, so that you can sort of plan or better gauge when and how to use your earned shares.
Got it. So I know now we're at the point, at least in the way that we've structured our conversation a little bit, about, okay, we're at the point where we want to sell our stocks that we've had vested. The next question, again, you have this awesome thing. What's the catch? How are they taxed now? Because if you have things vesting at different times, like, are they treated technically like long-term or short-term? Because we mentioned a little bit about the capital gains and taxation rules here, but they're sold after vesting, but not everybody has the exact same vesting schedule. So how exactly does a person go about like weighing what the taxation impact is going to be for their situation?
Right. So again, excluding any sort of personal special circumstances and tax events that need to be observed by the individual. If the shares are held for more than 1 year from the vesting date, any capital gains or losses will be considered long-term. If the shares are held for 1 year or less, so months, any capital gains or losses will be considered as short-term. So, again, the taxable events determine on the duration of the employee maintaining that particular stock or being an active participant in that stock.
Right. So that long-term or short-term designation is from the actual vesting date. Not
correct.
Yeah. So it's from when they become not restricted and yours, and that forward becomes your time for your figuring out your tax implication, I guess. So now the part that a lot of people visit, sometimes they don't want to visit this, sometimes it's called the golden handcuffs, which is you don't want to have to leave behind anything that you didn't get yet. What happens if you leave a company before they vest? Because some people open up that brokerage account and they're like, oh geez, it may have been a rough day, but I can't leave now. Look at that beautiful number in there. That's a scary thing. So what happens if you were to leave the company?
Yeah, so very much a valid question, and again, sort of ties back to the beginning of this conversation, in that the whole point behind setting up these long-term incentive plans is for the employee to be sort of enticed into staying with a particular employer, right? That growing account balance as you continue to vest and sort of receive more grants for your contribution to the employer. It makes the conversation about leaving that much more difficult. Well, most employers only require time-based vesting. So you'll need to stay at the company long enough to earn those shares, right? Typically, a portion of the grant will begin after 1 year of service. As I said, that's sort of the common, at least fractional vesting schedule. But the details of that again will be explained in the plan documents. If your shares are vested, that's definitely a good thing, obviously, because that means you have met the necessary requirements. But leaving unvested shares behind due to your departure or termination from the employer, again poses another question or considerations.
Okay, so for that portion, really, when it comes to when you're leaving your company, a lot of it you can probably find within the terms of your grant, as it's company specific usually.
Absolutely.
Based on what you're telling me and some of my research. But with these programs, are there any real caveats with the different types? I know we covered a lot today. I know for myself, the RSU is probably one of the most familiar items, since it's like, hey, you'll get this at this date and then it's yours. Are there any specific comparisons or caveats that come with that?
So I mean, maybe let's just quickly discuss the sort of pros and cons of restricted stock units. So one of the pros would be that it incentivizes employees to stay with the company. Secondly, employees receive the capital gains, less the value of the shares withheld from income taxes, and there are minimal administrative costs. Right, so the employee frequently has little to no cost, and then on the employer side, right, from a plan perspective, those tend to be on the lower end. RSUs, as mentioned earlier, don't provide dividends. Some provide dividend equivalent payments; those are slightly different. And RSUs aren't considered, employees' property. So again, circling back to that vesting requirement. And for RSUs, no voting rights. So
yeah, right. So it's just the trade-off. So essentially, like with that tangible property piece, you can't really pay the tax before the vesting period. And that's the one item line that I think a lot of people don't always think about when it comes to these types of, whether you want to call them grants, plans, options, etc., is once they become yours, it's great, but you still have to make sure that the taxation that's implicated on you is able to be covered. And that kind of is the area here where some people are like, there's a real nice chunk of change coming my way, but you can't pay that tax until it becomes yours. And you also don't know what the market's going to be like. So your taxation that comes in the market could be swinging way high and it's going to be a big bill, or you get a bearish day and, it's not as much of a punch to the wallet as some of the others. But I know we covered some of the cash versus shared, or cash versus taking out taxes from shares here today. But I think for an easy intro and understanding some of the different aspects and facets of stock vesting, this will be helpful for our listeners. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And listeners can learn more about an array of financial topics for free at any time at IBKRcampus.com. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks for listening to IBKR's Sense of Security. As always, there's more content at IBKRpodcast.com. And if you're interested in learning more about interactive brokers, visit IBKR.com. We offer more trading education content such as webinars, market commentary, market-related courses, and quant-related articles at IBKRcampus.com. The analysis in this material is provided for information only and is not and should not be construed as an offer to sell or the solicitation of an offer to buy any security. To the extent that this material discusses general market activity, industry or sector trends, or other broad-based economic or political conditions, it should not be construed as research or investment advice. To the extent that it includes references to specific securities, commodities, currencies, or other instruments, those references do not constitute a recommendation by IBKR to buy, sell, or hold such investments. This material does not and is not intended to take into account the particular financial conditions, investment objectives, or requirements of individual customers. Before acting on this material, you should consider whether it is suitable for your particular circumstances and, as necessary, seek professional advice. The information in this material is provided for informational purposes only and does not constitute tax advice and cannot be used by the recipient or any other taxpayer to avoid penalties under any federal, state, local, or other tax statutes or regulations or to resolve any tax issue.